The crack of a gunshot echoed through the arid Montana landscape as Grace Nichols hurried down the dusty trail, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was 1885, and the territory was still wild enough that gunfire could mean anything from a hunting expedition to a deadly confrontation. The sound had come from beyond the bend in the road, past the grove of cottonwoods that marked the boundary of her family's homestead. Grace paused, adjusting the basket of medical supplies she carried. At 24, she had already earned a reputation in Silverdale County as a skilled healer, having learned the trade from her father before he passed. She'd been heading to the Wilsons' farm to tend to their youngest, who had come down with a fever, but that gunshot changed everything. Another shot rang out, followed by the distant thunder of hoofbeats growing fainter. Something had happened, and whoever had done it was riding away. Grace lifted her skirts and ran, the late afternoon sun beating down on her bonnet as she rounded the bend. Her boots kicked up clouds of dust as she came to an abrupt halt at the sight before her. A man lay sprawled in the middle of the trail, his body half twisted in the dirt. Blood soaked through his shirt, staining the blue fabric a deep crimson. Beside him lay a worn leather hat, the kind favored by the cattle drivers who passed through these parts. Approaching cautiously, Grace knelt beside him. He was breathing, though barely, and she could see a wound in his side where the bullet had torn through. Another graze on his arm had bled enough to soak his sleeve. "Mister," she called, reaching out to check his pulse. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of a summer sky. His face was tanned and weathered, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. Despite his obvious pain, a crooked smile pulled at his lips. "Well now," he rasped, "if I'd known, heaven sent such pretty angels, I'd have gotten shot years ago." Grace's brow furrowed. "You're not dead yet, though you will be if that bleeding doesn't stop." She began to unpack her medical supplies. The man attempted to sit up, groaning as the movement sent fresh blood oozing from his wound. "Just a scratch, madam. I've had worse shaving." "Sir, you've been shot. Twice," Grace said firmly, pressing a clean cloth against his side. "Call me Seth," he replied, wincing. "Seth Grayson, and this is just bad luck. Fellow didn't appreciate losing at cards." He tried for another smile. "Say, you wouldn't happen to have a drink in that basket?" "Medicinal purposes, of course." Grace pressed her lips together as she examined the wound more closely. "What you need is stitches, not whiskey. And you need to stop talking so I can think." "Talking's about the only pleasure left when a man's leaking his life onto the trail," Seth quipped, though his voice was growing weaker. "Let me help or be quiet," Grace snapped, her patience worn thin by worry. "I can save your life, Mr. Grayson, but not if you keep moving and talking." Something in her tone must have reached him, because Seth's smile faded, replaced by a serious nod. "Yes, madam," he whispered. Grace worked quickly, cutting away his shirt to better access the wounds. The bullet to his side had gone clean through, missing vital organs but causing significant blood loss. The graze on his arm was less severe but would also need attention. "I need to get you somewhere clean. My home is just beyond those trees," she said, nodding toward the cottonwoods. "Can you walk if I help you?" Seth nodded, gritting his teeth as Grace helped him to his feet. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and despite his injuries, she could feel the solid strength of him as he leaned against her. He smelled of leather, horses, and gunpowder, the scent of a man who lived his life on the move. "My horse," he managed, looking back down the trail. "Gone," Grace said simply. "Whoever shot you either took it or spooked it off." Seth cursed under his breath, then immediately apologized. "Pardon my language, madam." "I've heard worse," Grace assured him as they began the slow, painful journey toward the Nichols homestead. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Grayson?" "Seth," he corrected, his breathing labored. "Just passing through. Was headed to Silverdale. Heard they needed hands at the Blackwood Ranch." Grace nodded. "They do, but you won't be much use to them with bullet holes in you." The walk to the Nichols property took nearly half an hour, though it should have been just 10 minutes. By the time they reached the modest 2-story house that Grace's father had built 15 years earlier, Seth was barely conscious, leaning heavily against her. "Almost there," she encouraged him, guiding him up the porch steps and through the front door. "Just a little further to the kitchen table." The house was quiet. Grace's mother had passed 5 years ago, and her younger brother Thomas had left for Denver to seek his fortune 2 years past. Since her father's death last winter, Grace had lived alone, continuing his medical practice and tending to the small farm that provided her living. With a final effort, she helped Seth onto the sturdy oak table that served as her operating surface when needed. He lay back, his face alarmingly pale beneath his tan, his breathing shallow. "Cold," he murmured. "That's the blood loss," Grace explained, lighting lamps and gathering what she would need: needle, thread, clean bandages, and the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. "I need to clean and stitch those wounds. It's going to hurt." Seth managed a weak laugh. "Can't hurt. Worse than getting shot." "You'd be surprised," Grace replied, pouring whiskey onto a clean cloth. "Bite down on this," she added, offering him a rolled piece of leather. Seth shook his head. "Just give me a swig of that bottle. I'll be fine." Grace hesitated, then relented, helping him take a long drink before setting to work. To his credit, Seth remained silent through most of the procedure, only an occasional sharp intake of breath or low groan betraying his pain, as Grace extracted fragments of cloth from the wounds, cleaned them thoroughly, and stitched them closed with neat, even sutures. By the time she finished bandaging him, the sun had set, and Seth had passed out from the combination of pain, blood loss, and whiskey. Grace couldn't move him from the table alone, so she made him as comfortable as possible, placing a pillow beneath his head and covering him with a blanket. In the lamplight, with his face relaxed in unconsciousness, Seth looked younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so. His features were strong and well-defined, a straight nose, firm jaw, and surprisingly long eyelashes for a man. His dark hair was overlong, curling slightly at the ends. Grace caught herself staring and shook her head. Whoever this cowboy was, he was just another patient one who would need careful tending if he was to survive the night. She pulled a chair close to the table and settled in for a long vigil. Outside, the Montana night came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes, while inside, the only sound was the steady breathing of a wounded man fighting to stay in this world. Seth Grayson woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the most intense thirst he'd ever experienced. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then, the pain in his side brought everything rushing back: the card game in the saloon, the accusations of cheating, the confrontation on the trail, and finally, the beautiful woman who had saved his life. He turned his head and found her asleep in a chair beside him, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, her honey-brown hair coming loose from its pins to frame a face that even in sleep looked determined. She'd changed him out of his bloodied clothes, he realized, looking down at the unfamiliar nightshirt he wore. The thought brought an unexpected flush to his cheeks. "Madam," he called, his voice a dry rasp. "Miss?" Grace startled awake, her hazel eyes widening as she took in the fact that her patient was conscious. "You're awake," she said, immediately reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Seth admitted, "but alive, thanks to you." Grace nodded, satisfied with his pulse. "Your fever broke around dawn. That's a good sign. Are you thirsty?" "Parched," he confessed. She helped him sit up slightly, supporting his back as he drank deeply from the cup she offered. The water was cool and sweet, the best thing he'd tasted in years. "Thank you, miss." He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Grace," she supplied. "Grace Nichols." "Miss Nichols," Seth repeated. "I owe you my life." A small smile touched her lips. "Let's see if you survive another day or two before you start making grand declarations, Mr. Grayson." "Seth," he reminded her, "and I'm tougher than I look." "You'd have to be, to survive those wounds," Grace agreed. "What really happened on that trail? And don't tell me it was just a card game gone wrong. Those weren't the shots of a drunken gambler." Seth's expression sobered. "You're perceptive, Miss Nichols. No, it wasn't just cards. The man recognized me from somewhere, said I'd cost him 6 months in a Cheyenne jail." "And had you?" Seth met her gaze steadily. "I used to ride with the law, deputy U.S. Marshal out of Wyoming Territory for 3 years, made my share of enemies." Grace's eyebrows rose. "Used to." "Turned in my badge last year," Seth said, a shadow crossing his face. "Saw too much, did too much, needed Something else. Grace studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine the truth of his words. Finally she nodded. Well, former Marshal Grayson, you'll be staying here until those wounds heal enough for travel, doctor's orders. Are you a doctor then? Seth asked, genuinely curious. Not officially, Grace admitted. My father was the doctor in these parts for 20 years. I learned from him. When he passed, there was no one else, so I continued his work. Seth nodded thoughtfully. The people around here are lucky to have you. A slight flush colored Grace's cheeks at the compliment. Rest now, she said, rising from her chair. I need to check on the Wilson's boy. He had a fever yesterday. I'll be back before noon with something for you to eat. I'll be here, Seth said with a weak smile, gesturing to his prone position. Not much choice in the matter. Grace paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mr. Grayson, Seth, the man who shot you. Will he come looking to finish what he started? Seth's expression darkened. Possibly. Did anyone see you bring me here? Grace shook her head. Not that I'm aware of. We're somewhat isolated. Good, Seth said, but keep your doors locked just in case. Grace nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the small revolver she kept in her apron pocket, another legacy from her father, who had insisted she learn to protect herself. I always do. After she left, Seth lay back against the pillow, taking stock of his situation. He was alive thanks to this remarkable woman, but he was also vulnerable and potentially putting her in danger. As soon as he could move without reopening his wounds, he would need to make a decision: stay and risk bringing trouble to Grace Nichols's door, or leave and face whatever was waiting for him on his own. The thought of leaving didn't sit well with him, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was just gratitude, or perhaps it was the memory of those determined hazel eyes that had commanded him to be quiet and let her save his life. The next 3 days passed in a haze of pain, sleep, and slow healing for Seth. Grace proved to be not only skilled with the needle, but also an excellent cook, preparing hearty stews and fresh bread that helped restore his strength. She changed his bandages twice daily, her touch gentle but sure, her manner professional but kind. By the 4th day, Seth was able to sit up on his own and move to a chair by the window, where he watched Grace tending to her garden and caring for the few animals she kept: chickens, a milk cow, and an elderly horse that had once pulled her father's buggy. You manage all this on your own? He asked that evening as she served a simple but delicious dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread. Grace nodded, taking the seat across from him at the small kitchen table. Since my father died last winter, my brother Thomas is in Denver working for a newspaper. He sends money when he can, but she shrugged. I manage. It's a lot for one person, Seth observed, noting the calluses on her hands and the weariness she tried to hide behind her practical demeanor. Life is a lot for one person, Grace replied with a small smile. But it's the only one we get, so we make do. She studied him for a moment. What about you? Any family waiting for you somewhere? Seth shook his head. No one. My parents died of influenza when I was 18. No siblings. Had a girl once back in Kansas, but she married a banker while I was off chasing outlaws. He attempted a smile. Can't blame her. Banking hours are more predictable than a marshal's. Grace's expression softened with sympathy. And now? What are you looking for in Silverdale? A fresh start, I suppose, Seth said honestly. Somewhere quiet to put down roots. I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Says the man who got himself shot on my doorstep, Grace remarked dryly. Seth laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. Fair point, but that was the old business catching up to me. I'm hoping to leave that behind. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Grace frowned, setting down her spoon. I'm not expecting anyone, she murmured, reaching for her pocket where Seth knew she kept her small revolver. Let me, Seth said, starting to rise, but Grace waved him back down. You can barely stand, she reminded him. Stay put. Her expression softened slightly. But thank you for the offer. Seth watched anxiously as Grace approached the door, her hand still in her pocket. She called out, Who's there? And visibly relaxed at the response. It's just Sheriff Pruitt. she explained to Seth, opening the door to reveal a gray-haired man with a weathered face and the star-shaped badge of the local law. "Evening, Grace," the sheriff said, removing his hat. His eyes landed on Seth, narrowing slightly. "I see you have company." "This is Seth Grayson," Grace introduced him. "He was injured on the trail. I've been tending to his wounds." Sheriff Pruitt nodded slowly. "Mr. Grayson, new to these parts?" "Yes, sir," Seth replied respectfully. "Was heading to Silverdale looking for work when I ran into some trouble." "What kind of trouble?" the sheriff asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "The kind that involves bullets," Seth admitted. "Old grudge from my days as a lawman." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "You wore a badge?" "U.S. Marshal's Office, Wyoming Territory," Seth confirmed. "Turned it in last year." Sheriff Pruitt studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Well, that's good to know. Actually, the reason I'm here is we found a body out by Eagle Creek yesterday. Man named Jed Harmon. Had papers on him from the Wyoming Territorial Prison. Thought you might know something about it, seeing as you're injured and new in town." Seth exchanged a glance with Grace before answering. "Harmon was the man who shot me. Can't say I'm sorry he's dead, but I didn't kill him. I was already bleeding in the dirt when I heard more shots and hoofbeats riding away. Someone else got to him after he got to you," the sheriff mused. "Any idea who might have wanted him dead?" Seth shook his head. "Harmon made plenty of enemies. Could have been anyone from his past. Or maybe he tried to rob the wrong person after he left me for dead." Sheriff Pruitt nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Mr. Grayson, once you're well enough to travel, I'd appreciate if you'd stop by my office in Silverdale. Might help to have your statement on record." "Of course, Sheriff," Seth agreed. After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell between Seth and Grace. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't tell me the man who shot you was dead." "I didn't know," Seth replied honestly, "though I'm not surprised. Men like Harmon tend to meet violent ends." Grace studied him, her expression troubled. "Does this mean you're safe now? Or will there be others?" Seth wished he could reassure her completely, but he respected her too much to lie. "Harmon was the only one who recognized me around here. But in this life, there are no guarantees." Grace nodded, accepting his answer. "Well, you're still not well enough to travel, so it's a moot point for now. Finish your dinner before it gets cold." As they resumed their meal, Seth found himself watching Grace, noting the way the lamplight caught in her hair and the determined set of her jaw. She was unlike any woman he'd ever met capable. Independent and fearless. The kind of woman a man could build a life with if he were lucky enough to win her heart. The thought caught him by surprise. He'd come to Montana Territory seeking solitude and simplicity, not entanglement. Yet here he was, sitting at Grace Nichols' table, already imagining what it might be like to stay. By the end of the second week, Seth was able to move around the house with reasonable comfort, though Grace still insisted he avoid strenuous activity that might tear his stitches. He had taken to helping with small chores, washing dishes, shelling peas, and even attempting to mend a broken chair in the sitting room. "You're good with your hands," Grace observed one afternoon, as she returned from visiting a patient to find Seth had not only fixed the chair, but also repaired a loose floorboard on the porch. "Had to be," Seth replied with a shrug. "On the frontier, a man who can't fix his own gear doesn't last long." Grace removed her bonnet, hanging it on a peg by the door. "True enough, my father always said the same." She hesitated, then added, "I had a letter from my brother today. He's getting married in the spring." "That's wonderful news," Seth said, noting the mixture of happiness and something like loneliness in her expression. "Will you go to Denver for the wedding?" "If I can," Grace said, moving to the kitchen to put away the herbs she'd collected on her way home. "It's a long journey, and I'm not sure who would look after things here." Seth followed her, leaning against the doorframe. "You deserve a chance to celebrate with your family." Grace glanced at him, her expression softening. "Perhaps. We'll see when the time comes." She changed the subject. "Sheriff Pruitt stopped me in town. He asked if you were well enough to come to Silverdale tomorrow to make your statement." Seth nodded. "I can manage the ride. It would be good to see the town anyway, since I still plan to look for work there." Something flickered in Grace's eyes, disappointment, but she quickly masked it. Of course. You must be eager to get on with your plans. I didn't say that, Seth said carefully, taking a step closer to her. Grace, these past 2 weeks have been about your recovery, she finished for him, turning back to her herbs. And you've made remarkable progress. Soon, you'll be well enough to resume your life. Seth frowned, sensing she was deliberately creating distance between them. My life before I met you wasn't much of a life at all. Just wandering, trying to outrun memories. Grace's hand stilled, but she didn't turn around. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe there's something worth staying for, Seth said quietly. Someone. Grace finally turned to face him, her expression guarded. Seth, you don't owe me anything. I would have done the same for anyone in need. This isn't about debt, Seth insisted. It's about finding something I wasn't even looking for. A flush rose in Grace's cheeks, but she shook her head. You hardly know me. I know enough, Seth countered gently. I know you're brave and skilled and stubborn as a mule. This drew a reluctant smile from her. I know you work yourself to exhaustion caring for others. I know you keep that revolver in your pocket but have nightmares about using it. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening, and you take your coffee with honey instead of sugar. Grace's eyes had widened slightly. You've been paying attention. To every detail, Seth admitted. But if you want me gone, just say the word. I won't impose where I'm not welcome. A long moment passed between them, the air heavy with unspoken feelings. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want you gone. That's what frightens me. Seth took another step toward her, close enough now to reach out and touch her cheek if he dared. Why does it frighten you? Because people leave, Seth, Grace said, vulnerability breaking through her usual composure. They die or they move on. My mother, my father, Thomas, I've learned to depend only on myself. Some people stay, Seth said softly, if you give them reason to. Their eyes locked, and Seth could see the battle being waged within her, caution against hope, fear against longing. Before either could say more, however, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Grace moved to the window, peering out. Riders? She said, her brow furrowing. 3 of them. I don't recognize them. Seth joined her at the window, instinctively positioning himself slightly in front of her. The 3 men approaching were rough-looking, trail-worn, with the hard eyes of men who lived outside the law. One of them, a tall man with a distinctive red bandana, looked vaguely familiar to Seth, though he couldn't immediately place him. Get your gun, Seth said quietly to Grace, and stay inside. What are you going to do? Grace asked, already moving toward where she kept her revolver. Talk to them, Seth replied grimly, and hope they're just passing through. Seth stepped out onto the porch as the riders approached, keeping his movements casual despite the tension coiling within him. His gun belt was hanging inside, but he had tucked Grace's father's old Derringer into his boot that morning, a precaution that now seemed prescient. Afternoon, gentlemen, he called as they reined in before the house. Something I can help you with? The man with the red bandana leaned forward in his saddle, squinting at Seth. Well, I'll be damned. Seth Grayson, heard you was in these parts. Recognition dawned on Seth as he placed the voice. Cole Turner. Last I heard you were serving 10 years in Yuma. Turner grinned, revealing a gold tooth among otherwise rotting ones. Got out early. Good behavior. His companions chuckled at this obvious lie. What brings you to Montana? Seth asked, keeping his tone neutral while his mind raced through options. Heard about what happened to Jed Harmon, Turner replied, his grin fading. He was a friend of mine. We rode together back in '80. Sorry for your loss, Seth said, not meaning a word of it. But as I told the sheriff, I didn't kill him. Turner shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. Don't much care either way. See, Jed told me before he died that you were carrying something valuable. Something that belongs to us. Seth's confusion was genuine. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Grayson, Turner snapped, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. The map? Jed said you took it off him after you arrested him in Cheyenne. Seth shook his head. There was no map, just some stolen money and a wanted poster for his brother. Turner's eyes narrowed. You're lying, and I don't like liars. He nodded to his companions. Search the house. No, Seth said firmly, stepping to block the porch steps. There's a lady inside who has nothing to do with this. You want to search something? Search me." "Oh, we will," Turner assured him with a malicious smile. "But first, we'll have a look inside. Boys?" The two riders dismounted, hands on their weapons as they approached the porch. Seth tensed, knowing he was outnumbered and still not fully recovered, but determined to protect Grace. Before the men could reach the steps, the door opened behind Seth, and Grace stepped out, her revolver steady in her hands. "This is private property," she said, her voice remarkably calm. "I'm asking you to leave." Turner looked her up and down with an appreciative leer that made Seth's blood boil. "Well now, aren't you a pretty little thing? Didn't know Grayson had such fine taste in nurses." "My medical skills aren't the only thing I learned from my father," Grace replied coldly. "He was an excellent shot, taught me well." Turner's amusement faded, replaced by calculation as he assessed the new threat. "We don't want trouble with you, madam. Just need to have a word with Grayson here and look for something that belongs to us." "Nothing here belongs to you," Grace stated firmly, "and Mr. Grayson is under my care. Now, I'll say it once more, leave my property." A tense silence fell as Turner and his men exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering their approach. Finally, Turner spoke. "All right, madam, we'll go for now. But this ain't over, Grayson. That map is worth a fortune, and I mean to have it." "There is no map, Turner," Seth insisted. "Whatever Harmon told you, he was lying." Turner spat into the dust. "We'll see about that. We'll be watching. And when you leave this little love nest, we'll be waiting." With that ominous promise, he wheeled his horse around, his men following suit, and the three rode away at a steady trot. As soon as they were out of sight, Grace lowered her gun, her hand trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "Who were they? What map were they talking about?" Seth turned to her, his expression grim. "Cole Turner is an outlaw I helped put away 5 years ago. As for the map," he shook his head, "I have no idea. Harmon never had any map when I arrested him, just some stolen cash and wanted posters." "They'll be back," Grace said quietly, looking down the empty road. Seth nodded, taking her arm gently and guiding her back inside. "Yes, they will, which is why I need to leave. Today. I won't put you in danger any longer." "Don't be ridiculous," Grace protested as they entered the house. "You're still healing, and where would you go? They'll just follow you." "Better that than bringing trouble to your door," Seth insisted, moving to gather his few belongings. "I'll go to Silverdale, talk to Sheriff Pruitt. Maybe he can help sort this out." Grace caught his arm, stopping him. "Seth, think this through. If they believe you have this map, they'll come after you whether you're here or in town. At least here, there are 2 of us, and we have the advantage of knowing the territory." Seth hesitated, torn between his desire to protect Grace by leaving and the logic of her argument. "I can't ask you to risk yourself for my troubles." "You didn't ask," Grace pointed out. "I offered. Besides," she added with a hint of her usual practicality, "I've invested too much time in keeping you alive to have you get yourself killed now." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Seth found himself smiling. "When you put it that way, but we'll need to be prepared. Turner doesn't give up easily." Grace nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we'll prepare, together." The word hung between them, laden with meaning beyond their immediate predicament. Together. It sounded right in a way Seth hadn't expected. "Together," he agreed softly, reaching out to touch her cheek in a gesture of tenderness that surprised them both. "But first, we need to figure out what map Turner is talking about, because I swear to you, Grace, I never took anything like that from Jed Harmon." Grace leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes holding his. "I believe you. Which means either Harmon lied to Turner about the map, or it exists, but I don't know about it," Seth finished thoughtfully. "Harmon was searched when I brought him in. Standard procedure. If he had a map, it would have been logged with his possessions." "Could it have been hidden?" Grace suggested. "Sewn into his clothes or something similar?" Seth frowned, thinking back. "Possibly. He had a leather vest that was pretty worn. Could have been something hidden in the lining. And where would that vest be now?" "With his personal effects, I suppose. They would have been returned to him when he was released from prison." Seth's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Unless what?" Grace prompted. "Unless they weren't all returned," Seth said slowly. "Sometimes, if an item is damaged or thought to be contraband, it might be kept or destroyed." What if the map was hidden in the vest, and when the vest was damaged or cleaned? The map was discovered, Grace concluded, and now Turner thinks you have it because you were the arresting officer. Seth nodded, the pieces falling into place. It makes sense. Harmon probably told Turner I took it deliberately, rather than admitting he lost it in prison. So what do we do now? Seth considered their options. First, we secure the house. Then tomorrow I'll go to Silverdale as planned to speak with Sheriff Pruitt. I'll explain about Turner and ask him to send a wire to the Wyoming Territorial Prison about Harmon's possessions. Grace nodded her agreement, though concern still clouded her features. And in the meantime, we wait for Turner to make his move. He won't wait long, Seth predicted grimly. Men like Turner aren't known for their patience. As night fell, Seth and Grace prepared as best they could for the possibility of an attack. They barricaded the doors, loaded all available firearms, and positioned themselves strategically, Seth in the front room with a clear view of the approach to the house. Grace upstairs where she could see the back of the property from the window. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling and the distant calls of night creatures. Around midnight, Grace came downstairs to check on Seth, finding him still alert at his post. "You should get some rest," she said, setting a cup of coffee beside him. "I'll keep watch for a while." Seth shook his head. "I'm fine. You're the one who worked all day." Grace settled into the chair across from him, her revolver in her lap. "I couldn't sleep anyway. Too many thoughts." Seth studied her in the dim lamplight, noting the worry lines between her brows. "I'm sorry, Grace, for bringing this trouble to you." "You didn't bring it," she corrected him. "It found you, and I happened to be there to patch you up." "That's not your fault." "Still," Seth insisted, "when this is over, I'll make it right." Grace offered him a small smile. "Just stay alive. That will be right enough for me." They fell silent for a moment, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. Finally, Seth spoke, his voice low. "Before Turner and his men showed up today, we were talking about reasons to stay." Grace's eyes met his, vulnerability and hope warring in her expression. "We were." "I meant what I said," Seth told her softly. "I wasn't looking for anything when I came to Montana, just a quiet place to start over, but finding you, it changed things." "Seth, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of time. Sometimes you just have to recognize what matters when you find it." Grace's breath caught, her eyes never leaving his. "And what matters to you?" "You," Seth said simply. "Your courage, your kindness, your stubborn determination, the way you command a bleeding cowboy to be quiet and let you save his life." This drew a soft laugh from her. "I'm not asking for promises, Grace. Just a chance. A chance to see if what I feel, what I hope you feel too, could grow into something lasting." Grace was silent for so long that Seth began to fear he had misread everything. Then, slowly, she set her revolver aside and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. "My whole life," she said quietly, "I've taken care of others. My mother when she was ill, my father as he aged, the people of this county when they need healing. I never expected anyone to want to take care of me." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not very good at letting people in, Seth. But for you, I think I could learn." Seth reached out with his free hand to touch her cheek, his heart swelling with an emotion too big for words. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down until his lips met hers in a kiss as gentle as it was profound, a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she was smiling. "That's a very compelling argument for letting you stay," she murmured. Seth returned her smile, feeling for the first time in years that he had found his way home. "I've got plenty more arguments where that came from." Grace laughed softly, rising to her feet and returning to her chair. "Save them for after we deal with Turner and his men. One challenge at a time." As if on cue, a noise from outside caught their attention, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, trying and failing to be silent. Seth's expression hardened as he reached for his gun. "Seems like our visitors have arrived," he whispered. "Upstairs, Grace. Now." Grace shook her head, already moving to douse the lamp. I'm staying with you. Grace? Together, remember? She whispered firmly. Besides, I'm a better shot than you are right now with those stitches pulling at your side. Seth wanted to argue, but knew she was right. Fine. But stay low and behind cover. They positioned themselves on either side of the front window, peering cautiously through the curtains. In the pale moonlight, they could make out 3 figures approaching the house, Turner and his men, moving with the caution of predators stalking prey. They're spreading out, Seth whispered, one heading for the back door. Grace nodded. I see 'em. Seth made a quick decision. If they try to burn us out, we'll have no choice but to make a run for it. The root cellar has an exit that comes up near the old oak behind the barn. If I say run, that's where we go. Understood, Grace whispered back, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. The minutes stretched like hours as they watched Turner and one of his men approach the front porch, while the third disappeared around the side of the house toward the back. Seth's muscles tensed, ready for action, his wounded side throbbing with renewed pain as adrenaline coursed through his veins. A soft knock came at the front door, followed by Turner's voice, deceptively friendly. Grayson? Miss Nichols? Just want to talk. No need for anyone to get hurt. Seth and Grace exchanged glances, remaining silent and hidden. Come on now, Turner called again, his tone hardening. We know you're in there. All we want is the map. Hand it over, and we'll be on our way. Still, they made no response. Turner's patience, as Seth had predicted, quickly ran out. Have it your way, he growled. Boys, let's show them we mean business. The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the house, followed by a thud as someone climbed through a window. At the same moment, Turner began trying to force the front door. Now, Grace, Seth whispered urgently. The cellar. They moved swiftly through the darkened house toward the kitchen, where the trapdoor to the root cellar was located. They were halfway there when a figure loomed in the kitchen doorway, Turner's man who had entered through the back window. Without hesitation, Grace raised her revolver and fired. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled backward. Seth pushed past him, pulling Grace along toward the trapdoor. They're inside, the wounded man shouted to his companions. They're heading for the cellar. Seth wrenched the trapdoor open, helping Grace down the ladder before following quickly. Behind them, they could hear Turner and his remaining man storming through the house toward the kitchen. The root cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables. Seth led Grace through the narrow space to a wooden door set into the far wall. The emergency exit Grace's father had built years ago as a precaution against prairie fires. It might be stuck, Grace warned as Seth pushed against it. It hasn't been used in years. Seth put his shoulder into it, ignoring the pain that flared in his wounded side. With a groan of protesting wood, the door finally gave way, revealing a short tunnel leading up to the surface. Above them, they could hear Turner and his man in the kitchen, discovering the open trap door. They went down here, Turner shouted. After them, Seth urged Grace ahead of him into the tunnel. Go, I'm right behind you. Grace crawled quickly through the narrow passage, emerging into the cool night air behind the large oak tree. Seth followed moments later, wincing as his stitches pulled with the effort. The barn, he whispered, taking her hand. We can get horses and make for town. They ran crouched low through the moonlight, keeping the oak between them and the house. Behind them, angry shouts indicated that Turner and his men had discovered the tunnel. They reached the barn, slipping inside and closing the door quietly behind them. Grace's elderly horse nickered softly in recognition, while in the next stall, the mare Seth had purchased in Silverdale the previous week stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Saddle up, Seth instructed, already reaching for his mare's tack. We'll ride for Sheriff Pruitt's place. It's closer than town. Grace nodded, moving to ready her own horse. They worked quickly in the dim light filtering through the barn windows, aware that every second counted. They were just leading the horses toward the door when it burst open, revealing Turner, his face contorted with rage and his gun leveled at Seth's chest. End of the line, Grayson, he snarled. The map, now. Seth pushed Grace behind him, facing Turner with steady eyes. There is no map, Turner. Not here anyway. It's probably still sitting in a drawer at the Wyoming Territorial Prison. Turner's eyes narrowed. You're lying. He's not. Grace said firmly from behind Seth. "We figured it out tonight. The map was hidden in Harmon's vest. When he was arrested, it went to the prison with his possessions. It must still be there." Doubt flickered across Turner's face, but his gun remained steady. "A convenient story." "It's the truth," Seth insisted. "Send someone to check if you don't believe us. But there's nothing here worth killing for." Turner seemed to waver, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Then his face hardened again. "Even if that's true, you're still the man who put me away for 5 years. That's reason enough to pull this trigger." "And become a murderer again?" Seth challenged. "The sheriff already knows you're in the area, Turner. Kill us, and every lawman in the territory will be hunting you." A tense silence fell, broken only by the nervous movements of the horses and the distant sound of Turner's wounded companion calling for him from the house. Finally, Turner lowered his gun slightly. "I want to believe there's no map here, Grayson. I really do. But I can't take that chance." His eyes flicked to Grace. "The lady comes with me. Insurance. You can go to Wyoming and get that map. When I have it, she goes free." "No," Seth said immediately, his voice like steel. "That's not happening." "It's not a negotiation," Turner snapped, raising his gun again. Before either man could make another move, the sound of approaching riders cut through the night, multiple horses coming fast. Turner's head turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Seth needed. He lunged forward, knocking Turner's gun aside as it fired, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the barn wall. The two men crashed to the ground, grappling for control of the weapon. Despite his injured state, Seth fought with the desperation of a man with everything to lose. Turner was strong and vicious, landing a blow to Seth's wounded side that sent waves of agony through him. But Seth held on, forcing the gun away from both of them. Grace didn't hesitate. While the men struggled, she grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall and brought the handle down hard on Turner's head. The outlaw went limp, slumping across Seth's legs. "Seth, are you all right?" Grace dropped to her knees beside him, helping to push Turner's unconscious body aside. Seth nodded grimly, his hand pressed to his side where fresh blood was seeping through his shirt. "I'll live, thanks to you and your pitchfork." The sound of riders was louder now, and moments later, voices called from outside the barn. "Hello, the house! Sheriff Pruitt here!" Grace helped Seth to his feet, supporting him as they moved to the barn door. Outside, Sheriff Pruitt and 4 deputies had arrived, their horses lathered from hard riding. "Miss Nichols, Mr. Grayson," the sheriff called, relief evident in his voice as he spotted them. "You're alive, thank God." "Sheriff," Seth acknowledged wearily, "your timing is impeccable." "Got word from a traveler who saw suspicious men heading this way," the sheriff explained, dismounting. "Thought I'd best check on you folks." His eyes narrowed as he took in Seth's bloodied shirt. "You're hurt." "Reopened my wound," Seth admitted, "but I'll be fine. Turner's unconscious in the barn. One of his men is wounded in the house. The third may have run off." The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who moved to secure Turner and search for his companions. "Let's get you both back to the house. You can tell me what this was all about while the doctor sees to that wound." "I can tend to it," Grace asserted, her arm still supporting Seth. "But yes, we have quite a story to tell you." As they made their way slowly back to the house, Seth leaned close to Grace's ear. "That was some swing with the pitchfork. Remind me never to get on your bad side." Despite everything, Grace smiled, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his heart skip. "Just don't ever give me reason to use it on you, and we'll be fine." Sheriff Pruitt, walking ahead of them, glanced back with a knowing look. "You two make quite a team. Seems like that bullet did you a favor, Grayson, leading you to Miss Nichols here." Seth's arm tightened around Grace's shoulders. "Best thing that ever happened to me, getting shot," he agreed, earning an exasperated but affectionate look from Grace. "Only you would say something so ridiculous," she murmured, but her eyes told a different story. One of relief, tenderness, and burgeoning love. By dawn, Turner and his wounded companion were securely locked in the Silverdale jail, while the third man had indeed fled and was being tracked by 2 of the sheriff's deputies. Seth's reopened wound had been cleaned and re-stitched by Grace's capable hands, and Sheriff Pruitt had sent telegrams to both Wyoming Territorial Prison about Harmon's possessions and to the U.S. Marshal's office about Turner's capture. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of Grace's home, damaged but still standing, Seth and Grace sat together on the porch swing, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the morning chill. "Sheriff thinks they'll find the map right where we guessed," Seth told her, his arm comfortably around her waist. "Apparently, there have been rumors for years about a lost gold mine in the Black Hills. If that's what the map leads to, no wonder Turner was so desperate to get his hands on it." Grace rested her head against his shoulder, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes but contentment in her smile. Gold or no gold, it wasn't worth killing for. "No," Seth agreed softly, "but some things are worth fighting for." He turned slightly to look into her eyes. "Some people." Grace's smile deepened as she reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his stubbled jaw. "Is that what you were doing? Fighting for me?" "For us," Seth corrected, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "For a chance at something I never thought I'd find again. Hope, a future, love." The last word hung between them, new but somehow right. Grace's eyes shimmered with emotion as she leaned forward to kiss him gently. "I think," she said when they parted, "that I might have been fighting for the same thing. Ever since I found a bleeding cowboy in the dust who wouldn't stop making jokes." Seth laughed softly, pulling her closer. "Thank God you told me to be quiet and let you help." "Best advice I ever gave," Grace agreed with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes that now held promises of tomorrows filled with laughter, partnership, and love. As the sun rose higher over the Montana landscape, painting the distant mountains with gold, Seth Grayson and Grace Nichols sat together on the porch of what would become their home, survivors of a storm that had ultimately led them to each other. 5 years later, the Grayson homestead had expanded considerably from the modest house Grace had inherited from her father. A larger barn now stood where the old one had been, housing not just horses but also cattle that grazed on the expanded property. A new wing had been added to the house, providing space for Seth's workshop, where he crafted furniture that had gained a reputation throughout the county for its quality and artistry. But the most important addition was the small figure running across the yard, dark hair flying behind her as she chased a butterfly with determined concentration. "Sarah Rose Grayson!" Grace called from the porch where she sat shelling peas. "Not too far, sweetheart." The 4-year-old looked back with a grin that was the mirror image of her father's. "I'm just catching butterflies, Mama." Seth emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth as he watched his daughter's antics with obvious pride. At 35, the years had been kind to him, a few more lines around his eyes perhaps, but his step was sure and his smile came easily these days. "She's fearless," he remarked as he joined Grace on the porch, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Wonder where she gets that from?" Grace laughed, leaning against him. "Certainly not from the man who faced down outlaws with bullet holes in him." "Or the woman who threatened said outlaws with a pitchfork," Seth countered with a grin. "Poor child never had a chance at caution with us as parents." Their easy banter was interrupted by the approach of a wagon coming down the road toward their property. Seth squinted against the sun, then smiled in recognition. "Thomas and Emily," he noted, referring to Grace's brother and his wife, who had moved to Silverdale 2 years earlier when Thomas took over as editor of the local newspaper. Grace set aside her peas, smoothing her skirts as she rose. "They're early. Dinner won't be ready for hours." "They probably couldn't wait to share their news," Seth suggested, helping her to her feet with a gentleness that acknowledged the slight roundness now visible beneath her apron, evidence of their second child, expected in the winter. Sarah had already spotted the wagon and was racing toward it, squealing with delight as it pulled to a stop, and Thomas jumped down to sweep her into his arms. "There's my favorite niece!" he exclaimed, tossing her high enough to make her shriek with laughter. "I'm your only niece, Uncle Thomas," Sarah corrected him with the logic of a 4-year-old. "All the more reason you're my favorite," Thomas replied, setting her down to help his wife from the wagon. Emily, a schoolteacher from Denver, whom Thomas had married 3 years earlier, accepted Seth's hand as she stepped down, her own condition even more advanced than Grace's. "You look wonderful," Grace told her sister-in-law as they embraced. "How are you feeling?" "Ready for this baby to make an appearance," Emily admitted with a laugh, her hand resting on her prominent belly. "Another month seems an eternity." The two couples moved to the porch, where Seth brought out lemonade, while Sarah showed her uncle her collection of treasures rocks, feathers, and a turtle shell she had found by the creek. "We have news," Thomas announced once they were all settled. "That's why we couldn't wait until dinner." "You're moving again?" Grace asked, a note of concern in her voice. Thomas shook his head. "Nothing like that. We're here to stay." He glanced at Emily, who nodded encouragingly. "The newspaper is doing well, so well, in fact, that I've been able to purchase it outright from old Mr. Hendricks. As of yesterday, I'm not just the editor, but the owner of the Silverdale Chronicle." "Thomas, that's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, reaching out to squeeze her brother's hand. "Father would have been so proud." "He would indeed," Seth agreed, raising his glass in a toast. "To the new owner of the Chronicle, may your ink never run dry, and your stories always be true." They all laughed and drank to that, the conversation flowing easily among them as it had over the years of shared holidays, celebrations, and occasional hardships. Sarah eventually tired of adult conversation and wandered off to the edge of the porch, where she resumed her butterfly hunt under her parents' watchful eyes. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Thomas and Emily stayed for the dinner that Grace had prepared, joined by Sheriff Pruitt, now retired but still a frequent visitor, and Dr. Winters, the young physician who had moved to Silverdale 3 years earlier, allowing Grace to scale back her medical work to focus on her family, though she still assisted with difficult cases and deliveries. After their guests had departed and Sarah had been tucked into bed with a story about brave princesses who saved knights from dragons, Seth's specialty, Grace and Seth found themselves once again on the porch swing where they had sat that morning 5 years ago after Turner's capture. "Happy?" Seth asked softly, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the same love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "When I found you bleeding in the dust that day, I never could have dreamed where it would lead." Seth smiled, his free hand moving to rest gently on her belly where their second child grew. "I knew," he said simply. "Not the details, perhaps, but I knew from that first moment, when you ordered me to be quiet and let you help, that my life had changed forever." Grace laughed softly at the memory. "You were the most infuriating patient I'd ever had, making jokes while bleeding half to death." "It was either joke or panic," Seth admitted, "and I couldn't very well panic in front of the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." "Charmer," Grace accused fondly, settling more comfortably against him as the swing rocked gently. "Only with you," Seth promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes, the soundtrack of their life together on this land that had become truly home. "What do you think about Daniel for a boy?" Grace asked eventually. "After my father." Seth considered this. "Daniel Grayson. Strong name. I like it." He paused. "And if it's another girl?" Grace smiled, having already given this thought. "Hope," she said simply. "Because that's what you brought back into my life. Hope for a future I'd stopped believing was possible." Seth's arm tightened around her, his heart too full for words for a moment. "Perfect," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. As the moon rose over the Montana landscape, bathing their world in silver light, Seth and Grace Grayson held each other close on the porch of the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life within it, filled with love, family, and the hope that had begun that day when she found the cowboy bleeding in the dust, and he had the good sense to finally be quiet and let her help.